Hi again, my name is Vanessa Nakate and I live in Kampala, Uganda, a country that has one of the fastest changing climates in the world. In the past few years, I have seen more and more how the climate crisis is affecting the African continent, which is ironic given that Africa is the lowest emitter of CO2 emissions of all continents except for Antarctica. Historically, Africa is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, and yet Africans are already suffering some of the most brutal impacts fueled by the climate crisis. Rapidly intensifying hurricanes, devastating floods, and withering droughts. Many Africans are losing their lives, while countless more have lost their livelihoods. The droughts and floods have left nothing behind for the people, nothing except for pain, agony, suffering, starvation, and death. A recent World Bank report warned that we could see up to 86 million people in sub-Saharan Africa alone displaced due to rising sea levels, desertification, declining fresh water, and food scarcity. Over the past few months, there have been deadly heat waves and wildfires in Algeria and devastating flooding in countries like Uganda and Nigeria. And the UN has declared that Madagascar is on the brink of the world's first climate change famine. Tens of thousands of people are already suffering catastrophic levels of hunger and food insecurity after 4 years without rain. Who is going to pay for Madagascar? And of course, this is not just happening on the African continent. Hurricanes Irma, Maria, Dorian, and Harold have left some islands in the Caribbean and Pacific totally uninhabitable. 6 million Bangladeshis have become displaced as a consequence of climate change. By 2050, 17% of the country's coastline will vanish underwater, creating an estimated 30 million climate refugees. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature recently announced that there are now well over 38,000 species on its red list, the best available catalogue we have of the species facing extinction. Who is going to pay for the lost islands of the Caribbean and Pacific? Who is going to pay for the communities who must flee the Bangladeshi coastline? Who is going to pay for the thousands of species that fall off of the scientists' red list and into the oblivion? How long shall the land mourn? How long shall the farms lay in ruins? How long shall the herbs of every field wither? How long shall the animals and the birds perish? How long shall children be given up for marriage because their families have lost everything to the climate crisis? How long shall children sleep hungry because their farms have been washed away, because their crops have been dried up, because of the extreme weather conditions? How long are we to watch them die of thirst in the droughts and gasp for air in the floods? Why is the state of the hearts of the world leaders who watch this happen and allow it to continue? Our leaders are lost and our planet is damaged. Loss and damage used to be something people thought of as happening only in the global south. As we have seen in the recent months with wildfires in California and Greece and floods in Germany and Belgium, loss and damage is now possible everywhere. Everywhere I go, leaders fall over themselves to say how they will achieve net zero by such and such a date to mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Sometimes I hear leaders talk about the need to fund adaptation efforts where mitigation will no longer be enough. And as we know, there are far too little evidence of the $100 billion per year that was promised to help climate vulnerable countries to meet these challenges. In fact, those funds were promised to arrive by 2020, and we are still waiting. But there is one thing I almost never hear leaders talk about, and that is loss and damage. For many of us, reducing and avoiding is no longer enough. You cannot adapt to lost cultures. You cannot adapt to lost traditions. You cannot adapt to lost history. You cannot adapt to starvation. And you cannot adapt to extinction. The climate crisis is pushing many communities beyond their ability to adapt. Why is it so easy for leaders to open up new coal power plants, construct oil pipelines, and frack gas, which are all destroying our planet and harming the present and future of their children, but so hard for them to acknowledge that loss and damage is here with us now? Climate action is not a pick and choose. Yes, of course, we need to avert and minimize as much of the future impacts as possible, but we also need to deal with the loss and damage that is already happening. It's time to take care of those who are most vulnerable from the climate impacts, which are no longer avoidable. Loss and damage has been whispered about on the edges of past COPs. It's time for leaders to put loss and damage at the center of the negotiations. And we need funding to help us deal with the damage that has already been caused, that has already happened, and the damage that we will not be able to avoid, no matter how much mitigation and adaptation is put into place. It's time to acknowledge that there must be additional funding on top of what has been promised for mitigation and adaptation. And it's time for that funding to come in the form of grants, not loans. Loans will only add debt on top of existing debts. It's time for our leaders to wake up. It's time for our leaders to stop talking and start acting. It's time to count the real costs, and it's time for the polluters to pay. It's time to keep the promises. No more empty promises. No more empty summits. No more empty conferences. It's time to show us the money. It's time. And don't forget to listen to the most affected people and areas. Thank you.